Okay, is that on? That is on. Okay, here we go. Oopsie, can't have that. Okay, so can I go over innovation again one more time? Absolutely. Okay, so obviously we're talking about innovation, right? So pretty easy to do. So innovation in Merton's strain theory, right, is you accept the cultural goal. So whatever your culture wants, right? Again, we'll talk about our culture now, basically material success, professional success, prestige, all of those things are sort of the cultural goals that most people have. So, someone who would want all of those things would potentially still be accepting the cultural goals. However, whatever way your society tells you is the proper way to get that, right? The institutionalized or normalized means. So in this case, right, if you're told to get rich, right, or you're told to be materially successful in life, the normal path to that, the institutional path or the normalized means is to go to school, to get a job, to stay out of trouble, not commit crimes, all of those things. So when you're talking about an innovator or someone who's in innovation, they would be like, yes, I want all of those things that the culture promises, but I don't want to go about it the normal way. So maybe, you are an entrepreneur who skips college. You're Bill Gates or you're, Mark Lizardface Zuckerberg. And instead of finishing your college degree, you jump right in and found your own tech company and you go about it that way. And that's how you go about getting the cultural goal that you are after, right? Your wealth, your prestige, and all of those things. Or, okay, so that would be a slightly more legitimate way. The other one, potentially could be to be like a drug dealer. I know, I'm sorry, I don't need to write this all out, but a drug dealer. So drug dealers, for the most part, right, are still interested in the cultural goals. They want money, they want prestige. And in some cases, right, if you're talking about organized crime, they might even want, the middle class house with the romantic partner, 2 kids, a dog, and all of that stuff. But how do they go about it? Not by the normal way that you would do it. They don't go to school, right? They start cooking meth or dealing cocaine or something like that. And that's how they go about being rich. So like Al Capone, anyone who's involved in organized crime, the godfathers, the head of mafia families and mob families, they're all still here, right, in terms of the cultural goal, but because they're not going about it in the normal and approved way, you end up in innovation. Okay, does that help at all? When will the study guide for midterm 2 come out? When I get it put together. I'll try to do that this weekend, but the exam's not till Friday next week, so we got some time. All right. Any other questions on this? Excuse me. Oh, yawning. Very, very nice. Okay. Nothing? All right, I'll wait for more questions to come. All right, other kind of forms of deviance, right? When we talk about, so we talked about subcultures a little bit when we talked about culture. When we talk about deviance and crime, there are also, deviant and criminal subcultures. Gangs, typically, we would talk about gangs as being a criminal subculture, right? Or a deviant subculture. But there can be all sorts of things, right? A subculture is a group that has a set of distinctive values, norms, and practices within the larger culture. So, there's all sorts of forms of kind of deviance that you can think about when you think of subcultures, right? So, I mean, one of my, one that might be seen as deviant in some ways, right? I've used them before. It's my friend, the furries. I know we all love the furries examples. That would be an example. Swingers, people who, basically go to swingers clubs and trade spouses, right? That would be a sexually deviant subculture, at least as it's defined by the mainstream. So those are all kind of deviant subcultures. And all of these subcultures, they might depart from mainstream culture in lots of ways, but within their own sorts of communities, they tend to be really, really, let me highlight this, highlighter, really strict conformists. This is especially true of a lot of criminal subcultures. When you look at, say, gangs, right? Gangs are really, really conformist in the way that they do things. Gangs have very strict rules, and you cannot violate those rules on threat of usually death, right? Or at least very serious physical punishment. And they establish these rules, right, and your entrance into it through things like initiation rites and initiation rituals and all of these sorts of things. But there are rules within, or codes. Okay, what I have here in this tiny little video clip it's from the show Riverdale. I promise to never make reference to that show again beyond this point. From the first season when it was still vaguely tolerable. But basically, this is Jughead's initiation into a gang, and there are codes, right? There's the code of the serpents. You kind of hear it in this clip, and it's obviously super stylized in terms of drug or gang culture, but it does the job of establishing how they have certain rules and codes. If I turn the volume on, that usually helps. Okay, I'll try that again. You're probably going to blow out your eardrums in a sec. Hang on.
No serpent is left for death! What is the fifth law? A serpent never betrays its own! What is the sixth? In unity, there is strength! In unity, there is strength! You know the laws. Now it's time for the next trial. Retrieve the knife. What?
Rattlesnake, Tony. A rattlesnake bit me and drew blood.
One that had its venom.
Stupid show. Okay. Right, so you see it's very stylized, right? But they go through the rules of this imaginary biker gang that's kind of styled on the Hells Angels. Real subcultures all have their rules, right? The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. That's the sort of thing that you would find in a lot of subcultures. Okay, criminal subcultures and justifications. What are the things that we find in a lot of cases with criminal subcultures, right? Whether it's gangs or other kinds of criminal subcultures. Is you often find people deny their personal responsibility for their actions. So, it's often, I didn't do it, right? They deny guilt at all, but often it is the system, right? It is the system that caused them to do it. In some cases, I need my red pen back here. It's denying that the thing is wrong at all. So it's not uncommon, say, if they're breaking into a car or stealing cars, especially really fancy ones, that they might deny that it's wrong at all, right? Because the people who they stole from are rich already, so who cares? Or, you sometimes hear this in some of the discourses, if they steal from stores, well, these stores are insured, right? They have insurance, so it's not really stealing at all. And you hear all kinds of justifications for why people commit crimes. Denouncing those who pass judgment on them. You don't know what my life is like. You don't know what I've been through. You have no idea where I come from. All of these things you hear in criminal subcultures, that somehow people don't understand them and that anyone passing judgment somehow just doesn't get it. That the victims got what they deserve, especially if the victims are rich, right? And appealing to higher loyalties. It's their loyalty to the gang or their loyalty to themselves that matters more than the fact that they committed a crime. Okay. Can we go over retreatism again? Oh, you're 5 minutes too late. No, of course. I'll go back. Give me a sec. I know. All right. I got to clear the slide. I've doodled on it enough. Erase. I've erased all the ink on this slide like 5 times. Okay, so retreatism. Very easy. Retreatism is giving up, right? This is, a person who no longer kind of chases after what they say you should have, right? What they say you should want in life. So the cultural goal has been abandoned, right? So there's no longer this idea that you should work hard so that you can get ahead in life, or that you could get wealthy, or at least do okay, right? Find a romantic partner, any of those things. That gets sort of abandoned, right? They give up on the cultural goals, and by doing so, they also give up on the institutionalized means, right? So instead of, going to work, trying to work hard, maybe they, just live in their mom's basement, right? It's always the neck beard in mom's basement that I always think of when I think of retreatism. Just go on the internet, consume a lot of pornography, play Call of Duty or Fortnite all day long, or whatever it happens to be, and you just kind of give up on the cultural goal. I don't know if that helps. Give me a sign if that makes sense. There's a lot of those. I'm going to take your silence as being golden. Okay. No, nothing. I'll do on Friday. I'm going to bring in, I'll do, not like a Kahoot, but I will bring in sort of like a mini Kahoot that I'll build into the slides, and we could test you on some of these. I'll give you some example questions on Merton's strain theory to see, how the class is doing with the concepts. And okay, you got it. Perfect. And we'll go from there. Okay. So we talk about strain theory, right? The whole thing is predicated on the idea that people commit crimes, right? They become deviant because society has promised them something, and it doesn't ultimately deliver that thing, and so they turn to crime. So one of the kind of criticisms that tends to come from, so here, this is what I'm highlighting here, right? This is a conflict theory criticism of functionalism, right? So basically, we talk about functionalism, right? This account that says there's a strong connection between things like crime and class, right? Because the poorer you are, the more likely you are to feel strain in Merton's sense. If you're more likely to feel strain, you're more likely to commit crime, and therefore what we should see is that the poorest people commit the most crimes. And so you do tend to see that, right? If you look at the straight up crime statistics, right? If you look at those uniform crime statistics that I talked about at the beginning of this unit, we do tend to see a lot more crime committed by poor people in the uniform crime statistics. Now, as I said, a little bit when I talked about Indigenous and Black people, one of the reasons we see that is because they're more likely to commit, street level crime or street crime, as opposed to white collar crime. So, when we've done kind of, looked at some of those other forms of reporting on crime, so things like self-report surveys, where people, admit to things like drug use, things like even low-level dealing, what we actually find is that for the most part, a lot of crime is relatively evenly distributed across socioeconomic classes. There are people committing crimes of all sorts across a whole range of socioeconomic classes. There is a sort of weak tendency for people to come from kind of those lower, working class and poor kind of socioeconomic classes, but it's much less concerted than that functionalist account and the idea of strain theory makes it seem, right? There's a much weaker association between being poor and committing crimes, because the fact is most poor people never commit crimes either. Most of them are law-abiding, and you find, crime in, the white collar, in the middle class, in the upper middle class. And often, it's just charged differently, and police organizations investigate it differently because it is seen as less serious than that street-level crime that happens. Okay. All right, I've got He-Man here. He's got the power. Typical white man with power. Sorry, it's a very conflict theory joke. I'm sorry. Straight white man has power. What a surprise. Okay. That says the straight white guy at the front of the class. Okay. So, what was I saying? Whatever. Conflict theory. All right, so conflict theory, right? We're back to our sort of Marxian account, right? That tends to kind of break people up into oppressed and oppressor classes, the powerful oppressing the weaker. And this is ultimately how they read a lot of the questions around criminal justice as well. So one of the things that conflict theorists, right, our Marxist friends will say, is that one of the things that happens, and here you can hear a little bit of interactionism in this point as well, is that the powerful, the wealthy, the privileged are the ones that write all of the laws, right? They're the ones that both write the laws and the ones that stress to, say, police organizations, which laws are going to be enforced, how they're going to be enforced, and what the penalties are going to be, right? So one of the things that conflict theorists will say, outside of just the straight economic sphere, right, even now into kind of things like critical race theory, which again is a conflict theory way of looking at race, one of the things that critical race theorists, again, which are conflict theorists, will say is that, because historically it's been, white people, principally white men, that have had the power to define who is criminal and who is deviant, they've tended to define, people not like themselves as criminal and deviant, right? So black people, indigenous people, Latino people, all of these sorts of things are more criminal, and the kinds of crimes that those people tend to commit are the ones that get prosecuted. So, I mean, amongst other things, right, things like property crime, you have to have property to have property crime committed against you. So it's those lower classes and those sort of marginalized racial groups that tend to commit those property crimes, and whose property is it that's being, had crimes committed against it. It's the kind of white upper class that owns all the property and all of those things, right? So they define then that those crimes are the worst crimes and that they should be prosecuted by the police because they control the government and the corrections apparatus, police, prisons, and all those things. Those are the people that tend to, they tend to go after, people of color, people of marginalized socioeconomic backgrounds, and all of those kinds of things. Very rarely do the rich and powerful get punished in the same way, right? And you'll have lawyers, openly admit that, the rich get a different treatment because they can afford better lawyers, right? And there's been lots of studies done, looking at differential sentencing. Black and indigenous people tend to get longer and harsher sentences than white people. And the more you can show that, say a nice, if two young people commit a crime, you're a nice kid from the suburbs, you have good parents, you just made a mistake, much less likely to get prosecuted than, say, someone who's from a poorer background, and especially someone who is of color. Okay, so basically the Marxist critique comes down to this, right? Power is used to perpetuate privilege, right? So the privileged have power, they use it to perpetuate their power. They avoid being defined as criminal, or if things they do are criminal, they're punished in much less serious ways, right? They're not going to land you with life in prison for most of the time for embezzling some money from your company. You might end up in a minimum security prison. You're not defined as a violent criminal or a dangerous criminal, so you're likely to be given day parole and parole much earlier. All of these sorts of things, conflict theorists think, are built into the criminal justice system because it defines certain people as deviant. Okay. So, control theory. So control theory comes from, let me highlight his name. You don't need to know his name for the exam. I don't test on names, but I'll talk about it anyway because I'll talk about Hershey. Okay, so Hershey, what does he say? So basically, control theory is pretty straightforward in lots of ways. What Hershey basically says is there are obviously social control mechanisms that stop people from committing crime, right? That people, the old adage that crime doesn't pay is wrong. Crime can pay very well, right? Being a drug dealer can pay very well. Smuggling people across the Mexican border can pay very, very well. Embezzling money from your employer can pay very, very well. I've heard. I have no idea. Don't look into my finances. I'm kidding. You would be appalled, but not because I have so much money, because I have so little. And I still drive my... Do I answer this? No. Can't talk now. What's up? Okay, there we go. One of the grad students in the department. They're probably calling me because they need money. That sounds worse than it is. I hold the bank account for the CCR, so if they need money, they need to get money from me. Okay, so Hershey's control theory, right? Basically this idea that crime pays, right? Criminality pays. It has big benefits. Going around the rules of society to get what you want obviously is something that people do because it works in some degree. So why don't people commit crimes, right? Why isn't crime rampant? Why do people stay within the bounds of the law? And basically what Hershey says, does she just need an Apple code? Oh dear. So the other thing, when you control all of the iPads and they're trying to change stuff on the iPads. Okay. I just have to text her. I'll be in 25 minutes. Sorry. They're going to prison this afternoon to do research, and they have iPads. And I'm the one who controls the iPads. So, or at least I used to. Okay, what was I saying? All right, goodbye phone. I'm not gonna look at you anymore. Okay, so people would commit crimes because it's effective. Why don't they? And what basically Hershey says is that there's a bunch of social controls, right? There's a bunch of, and he lists essentially 4. Other people have taken, the 4 types of social control from Hershey and branched them out to create other ones. But there's basically 4 things that are important to people that they value, and so they don't commit crimes. So the first one is social attachment, right? So social attachment being very, very important to people, right? You all have people in your lives that you care about. Is that going to make things ugly? It is. That doesn't matter. You all have things, people you care about, people that, your parents, your professors, your teachers, your high school football coach, your imam, your priest, your pastor, your aunt, all people that you care about, right? And whose opinions matter to you, for whom maintaining relationships is very, very important. And basically, what Hershey says is people will avoid violating norms and laws because it would put social attachments in jeopardy, right? So if you, let's say we'll go to the extremes. You start cooking meth in your house, right? And you get caught. What's going to happen to your relationship with your church-going aunt, right? Well, obviously that relationship is going to be damaged because they're going to, as you're being hauled off to prison, they're going to interview her and they're going to be like, oh, he or she was such a nice kid. Who would have ever guessed that they were cooking meth? I hope you're okay. And as once you get out of prison, that relationship is going to be damaged. And along a whole line, right? The more deviant you get, right? All the way from why don't you dye your hair fluorescent pink, all the way to why don't you cook meth. A lot of cases, right, it's because you damage social relationships along the way, right? If I had ever dyed my hair blue when I had hair, don't have it anymore, now I'd just be dyeing my scalp, which would look weird. My dad would have disowned me, right? He would have been like, okay, go fix your hair and come back when you're done. Dad does not like blue hair, right? So I never did it because it would have been putting that social relationship in danger. So right from those low levels like social diversion all the way up to consensus crimes, right? We don't do them in a lot of cases because we have relationships that we're trying to protect. Okay. Thing the second, which I'll highlight in blue, legitimate opportunities for education and good jobs. So according to Hershey, one of the other things you potentially put in danger or in jeopardy when you become deviant is legitimate opportunities for things like education and good job, right? So again, this can go right from social diversion all the way up to consensus crime. So obviously, right, if you cook meth or whatever, you commit you're dealing drugs and you're caught and convicted, right, you put your opportunities for work, a good job, maybe education, at risk because, if they run a criminal record check, it's going to come up that you have a criminal record. So at the level of like a consensus crime, you are putting things in jeopardy. But even at the level of like social diversion, the reason someone might not become deviant, say, I don't know, get a face tattoo, right? Which again is a social diversion, right? You get some kind of tattoo on your face. In some ways, you could be putting some of those opportunities at risk as well, because people are going to perceive you in a particular way, right? If you've got I don't know what kind of face tattoos people would get, or you got the tattoos creeping up your neck and around your eye, right? I don't know what people would get, but whatever it happens to be, people are going to perceive you in a particular way. At a job interview, you're not going to get the job because people are like, wow, that person must be deviant in some way. There may be a criminal because they have face tattoos or whatever it happens to be. So you don't do those things. You don't become deviant either at that low level or that high level of the pyramid because it puts opportunities in jeopardy. Alrighty. I'm almost out of tea. Okay. Ooh, it made green. I like it. Orange and blue makes green. Fun. Okay. The third one, involvement in conventional institutions. This one's pretty easy to explain, right? And it's the same kind of thing, right? There's a bunch of institutions that you are probably part of in your life, right? Whether that is social clubs, political parties, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, schools, workplaces, right? These are all sort of conventional institutions that you are part of in some way. In a lot of cases, right, if you become deviant in major ways, and again, you can go right from that low level of deviance, like social diversion, all the way up to consensus crimes. If you enter that kind of framework of deviance, your participation in some of these institutions can, ultimately become problematized. And honestly, like, just get a face, if you're part of a religious community, just get a face tattoo. No, I actually don't recommend, like, don't try this as an experiment. This is a terrible thing to say. Like, go get a face tattoo. No, don't do that. But if you got a face tattoo, right, and you went to like a community church in Wetaskiwin or something, right, you would get a very negative reaction and your ability to be involved in those communities would be affected, right? Same thing with school and work and other kinds of places. You might not be, if you applied for, say, a teaching job and you've got a face tattoo, problem. You apply for a teaching job and you've got a criminal record of some kind, it comes up on your security check. Again, that's going to cause you a problem. So it blocks, in some ways, your participation, even if you just want to volunteer, right? As an old folks home and you have a criminal record or a face tattoo, I'm really stuck on those two examples, it's going to put you in kind of jeopardy of losing connections with all these conventional institutions. All right, and the last one for Hershey. I'm going to put that in purple. All right, what do we get if we mix? No, we just get purple. Oh, that makes it really hard to see. I can't fix it now. I can. There we go. Try a different color. I know you probably don't need me to highlight, but I'm doing it anyway because it's fun. I just wrote on it. All right, screw it. All good. Green line, it's close enough. Your beliefs in traditional morals and values, or values and morality. Okay, so the other thing that might happen, right, if you become deviant is that you have to justify it to yourself, right? And most people, like, one of the things that's almost universally true about people is people have a really, really hard time. Now I went back to purple. I give up. No, I don't. I can do this. Okay. There we go. People have a really hard time with the idea that somehow something they've done is wrong, right? To live in a state perpetually where you think that morally you are in the wrong is something that most people simply cannot handle. And it's really, really difficult for people to handle this idea that they are doing something immoral. So one of the things that happens if you're going to move into deviance, you know in a sense inherently that you have to somehow come out of step with the morality of the community that you live in, right? That somehow, if you're off to the swingers club, right, so you're going to cheat on your spouse or your partner, right? You're putting yourself in, a state where you're going to have to justify that to yourself, right? Cheating's not that bad. They deserved it. They're horrible anyway. Whatever cheaters say, right? So you basically have to sort of put your beliefs then, because you have to justify your own beliefs, in opposition to kind of the beliefs of kind of mainstream society. So you put your beliefs, kind of your core beliefs often about morality, in jeopardy by going into deviance, because you know that it doesn't fit, and you know that you're going to have to then sort of adjust what you think about yourself or live with the disjunct of feeling like you're doing something wrong. So those are the 4 kinds of social control, right? So they all come from society, right? They're relationships with people, opportunities, institutional kind of ties, and kind of holding traditional values and norms that are all put in kind of jeopardy by deviance, which is why Hershey says most of us don't do it, because most of us want to protect these things so that we just get along with the rest of society. And it really comes down to the fact that most people are extraordinarily conventional. Most people are really, really boring, and that's okay. But most people are not, edgy, trying to break social rules. Most people are just trying to get along and move through their life in a normal way. And it's those kinds of social controls that we know if we violate it, right, that we're going to run into trouble. I definitely need a question slide in here somewhere. Oh dear, I did not put enough of them in. Okay, do I have tattoos? I do not. You can't see the face tattoo? No, I do not have any tattoos. Mostly I don't enjoy the idea of being poked repeatedly by a tiny needle. But no, I'm way too... Have I mentioned I'm like vanilla? And while I am the best-selling flavor of ice cream, I'm also the most boring one. I am vanilla embodied in a person. I'm sorry. Okay. So, social control, right? So what is social control and regulation when we talk about it, right? Essentially, when we talk about social control, it's basically the way the social system or social systems regulate people's behaviors, their feelings, their appearance, and all of the things that they do, and their thoughts, right? In a lot of ways, right? You're all under social control right now. And I heard about this really interesting kind of experiment, and I would love to do it, but I'm too terrified that you'll all hate me afterwards. Where basically, on the first day, a professor tells all the students to put their phones away, and that phones are not allowed in the class, and then proceeds to spend, go on their phone and just like start scrolling through Twitter, and then just wait until students are like, why don't we get to use our phone if you're using your phone? Like, what are you doing? And it's a really interesting kind of, most students will just sit there and wait for the person in authority to, change the frame. Why? Because you're all under social control right now. Multiple forms of social control are impacting you all the time, right? Your families, your religious background or no religious background if you don't have one, right? Social norms, right? What do your peers think? What do random passerbys think? What are the norms of the university? What happens if you cheat, right? These are all forms of social control that are kind of holding you, bound in. Okay, and control your behavior, your thoughts, right? And all the things that you think are okay and not okay to do, right? There's all sorts of controls around what language you can use in what spaces. These are all social controls, right? If you come up and you start swearing at me and yelling at me, you've violated a social norm. I'm going to call campus security, and you're going to get hauled off, right? That's a form of social control, and you know that. Okay, 2 major kinds that go back. 2 major kinds that we can think about, internal and external social controls, right? So internal social controls, and this is the one, say that, oops, I still got the highlighter on. I wanted to get the pen back. This is the one that Foucault says is the most important one now, is internal social controls, right? These are the social controls that control you because you've been socialized to do certain things, to know certain things, to think certain things are deviant, non-deviant, right, wrong, rude, not rude, all of those things, right, that we talked about when we talked about socialization and culture. When you kind of, when I tell the story, I know I told it to you, that I sat at a red light for 5 minutes waiting for it to turn green in the middle of the night because I know that's the rule. That's internal social control, right? There's no external thing controlling me. I'm just doing that because it's the right thing to do. When you don't use certain words in certain contexts or ever because you know that they're wrong, that's an internalized form of social control. All right, external forms of social control are different, right? It imposes punishments or offers rewards to people. So, when if you get caught cheating on your test and you are kicked out of the university, that's an external social control. Or, when you're speeding or you run that red light instead of being a good boy and sitting there for 5 minutes and the police, turn on the sirens and give you a ticket, that's an external social control. And the degree of social control or the form of punishment is going to vary from place to place and from time to time, right? So, if you went to, there's various differences in how things are punished in different places. There's not one universal form of social control at all times. And this is something that, Foucault points out in his book, Discipline and Punish. Pre-industrial societies were characterized by very strict social controls and high conformity, right? If you went back to the Middle Ages, and you went to the medieval village, because everybody knew everybody else's business, right? You were living in relatively small communities. You had strict social control and high conformity. As we've moved into industrial society, right, and big anonymous societies where you don't know your neighbors even, increasingly what we have is less stringent social control and lower conformity. And people have noted this, going all the way back to like the Roman Empire, that when people moved into big cities and they stopped being connected to the people around them in as deep of ways, you had much more deviance, which is why, like in the Roman Empire, you had a flourishing in the big cities of a bunch of new religious movements, Christianity being one, but you also had things like Mithraism, the cult of Osiris, and all of these kind of crazy, there's another one that I'm forgetting, Mithric cults, there's a bunch of them. Anyway, you had all of these crazy cults pop up. Why? Because you were suddenly in these big Roman cities that had very poor social bonds, low levels of social control. When you went out to the countryside, everybody worshipped like Zeus and, or I guess Jupiter and all the Roman gods. Why? Because you had, much more kind of strict conformity and high social control. So you had, new religions popping up in the Roman Empire in the cities, and that tends to be the case, right? Small towns are very conformist. Big cities are very non-conformist because they're much more anonymous, and that's still true today. I'm sure any of you who grew up in small towns will know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. So, some sociologists, right, specifically Foucault, has suggested that actually one of the things that's happening increasingly, and he talks about this kind of accelerating as technology grows, and Foucault died in the 80s, and so, honestly, I think he missed the best of it, and lots of people have taken this idea from him and talked about, the growth of surveillance culture in major ways. But some sociologists, today think that social control is intensifying in modern society. Specifically, while you might have more individuality and deviance on a personal level, it exists within very strict limits. And it's increasingly, this is straight out of Foucault. This is what's called biopolitics. Basically, any deviances and nonconformity individuality are allowed as long as they don't interfere with the functioning of capitalism and of the state, right? As long as you're in service of the state, right? As long as you're being a productive citizen, you're allowed a degree of freedom. But the second you turn against the state, you ultimately, lose all your rights very quickly. And one of the terms that Foucault talks about in terms of the way modern societies are set up is he suggests that increasingly modern societies are what's called a panopticon. So the panopticon is this weird metaphor. It comes from you don't need to know this for the exam, but it comes from this 19th century philosopher and kind of theorist named Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham, along with a bunch of other people, were trying to figure out what would be the best way to create a prison, right? A prison that basically would be the most efficient. And he came up with what he called the panopticon, right? Which is basically a circular prison, right, with cells all around on different levels, and at the center, a tower, right? I know, this looks like an amoeba, but go with it. It's my amoeba. Okay, so the idea behind the panopticon is that, basically the windows on here would be shaded, And so essentially, anyone in any of the cells would never know when a guard was looking at them, right? They could be observed at any time. And Bentham's theory was you wouldn't really need all that many guards in the panopticon, because if people think they are being watched at all times, they're just going to self-discipline, right? And this is kind of what Foucault picks up on, is his idea is though the whole of our society increasingly is panoptic, right? It's a panopticon. And you can kind of see what he means, especially, right, like whatever happens today, right? Like you go post something on Twitter, or X, I guess, as Elon wants me to call it now. We're on a first name basis. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, I wouldn't probably be here if I was on a first name basis with Elon Musk. But, you know, people can see everywhere what you say. Or there's this weird case going on in the US, right? And it's one of the prosecutors that's trying to prosecute Trump for election charges in Georgia. And it looks like she may have hired her boyfriend to be one of the prosecutors. They were having an affair when she hired him, and she's hired him, and then they've gone on a bunch of trips. And the really strange thing is that we know all of this because Trump's team hired a private investigator that subpoenaed all of their cell phone data. And basically is like, okay, you were at her house on this day, you sent her 1,000 text messages, and it stopped when you were at her house between 11 p.m. and 3 in the morning, after which point you left and went back to your own house where your wife was. Not the nicest guy. So this is the panopticon, right? You're being observed all the time, right? And you carry with you, in a sense, the means of your own repression, right? The means of your own surveillance, because, you know, through your cell phone, you can be observed at any time. There's been lots of cases where the police use kind of locational cell phone data to track people's activities. And it's like, well, you know, all we have is circumstantial evidence that you were near that murder site when it happened. So then we investigated you and found that you drive the same kind of car as we think the murderer drove. And then we got all this kind of situational data. So what basically Foucault is saying is that modern societies, you're being observed all the time, right? And why then do you follow all of the rules? Because you're being observed all the time. And as the technology gets more and more sophisticated, as it can see more and more of your life, you will actually become more and more conformist, right? In a kind of George Orwell 1984 world, you won't even have your own private thoughts, because things like your Amazon purchase history, you know, could be loaded and used against you, and all of these sorts of things. Okay. All right, maybe this is an interesting one to leave off on. The medicalization of deviance is a really interesting one. And again, this one comes to us from Foucault. Basically, the idea is that increasingly, what we used to think of as badness or moral kind of deformity, being immoral, not listening well, has increasingly come under the gaze of medicine. And I will tell you, because it's a huge push right now all over the psychology industry, one of the absolute most concrete forms of this is ADHD. Right, so when, you know, especially young boys, because young boys display ADHD in particular ways, which is inattentiveness and hyperactivity, right? So, like more on the hyperactivity than the attention deficit. What it used to be was that boys who were, you know, what we would call now ADHD, or have ADHD, rather, not, they aren't ADHD, would have been, you know, they don't listen, you need to discipline them more harshly, they need to be taught to listen, all of these sorts of things. Now, what happens is when a teacher notices that someone, you know, a boy may display this tendency, rather than put a moral category on it, they send them to a doctor, right? It's a disorder, right? It's right here, the D, that's disorder, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So that sort of more, increasingly, deviance has been medicalized, right? And we see this all over the place, right? You know, being transgender used to be thought of as a moral disorder, right? Something that, you know, the person was doing because they were somehow bad. Now, again, we have, what do they call it? Gender dysphoria as a diagnosis. It's medicalized, right? And again, I'm not making a moral claim about anything. I'm just saying that increasingly the things we used to think of as moral categories are increasingly now medical categories. They're ways that we trust who is the one we trust to talk about, you know, ADHD or about, being transgender, it's not the priest, right? I'm going to put priest, and I'm going to put a big X through it, but it is in fact, oops, I know how to spell, the doctor. And not even my kind of doctor, the real kind of doctor, right? The MD. Okay, so that's it. We'll leave it there. We'll pick up with all of my shiny stuff, and we'll pick it up on Friday. All right.